Egypt did not become a kingdom the day one king won one fight. It became a kingdom when one political center learned how to move grain, labor, law, and belief along the full length of the Nile, then keep that system running after the first generation of conquerors died. In the late 4th millennium, the Nile Valley was a competitive political landscape. Upper Egypt in the south had powerful centers such as Hierakonpolis, Nakada, and Abydos. The delta in the north had its own local authorities, trade networks, and sacred traditions. Elites in these regions were not waiting to be absorbed by somebody else. They were building their own power, financing followers, and competing for control over land, routes, and surplus. This is the background for Narmer. The famous Narmer palatate shows a ruler wearing symbols associated with both Upper and Lower Egypt. Visually, the message is blunt: one king, two lands, one order. Historians treat that object as royal political communication, not live coverage of a single battle. That caution matters. Even so, the broader archaeological pattern supports a real transition toward unification. Elite tombs at Abydos grow in scale. Administrative ceilings and tags spread. Storage and redistribution practices become more coordinated. The evidence points to a process in which authority is being concentrated and standardized. The central challenge was not symbolic, it was logistical. A ruler could defeat rivals in the south and still lose control in the north within one flood cycle if grain accounting failed, if local elites rebelled, or if commands could not move fast enough through officials. That is why early kingship in Egypt must be understood as a systems problem. Military force opened the door. Administration kept it open. By the first dynasty, rulers usually identified as Narmer, Horaha, Jijia, Jet, Den, and their successors appear inside a more coherent state structure. We do not know every succession detail with certainty, and later king lists compress and smooth early history. But the institutional trend is clear. Court-linked officials become more visible. Seal impressions and labels suggest tighter commodity tracking. Cemeteries and royal enclosures indicate durable elite hierarchy. Governance is becoming less personal and more procedural. Memphis becomes crucial in this story. Its position near the boundary zone between Upper Egypt and the Delta gave the court a practical advantage. From there, rulers could manage traffic between regions, supervise access to northern routes, and connect Delta production to Upper Egyptian political institutions. In plain terms, geography made Memphis a control node. It sat where a state that claimed two lands needed to stand. What exactly had to be built for unification to hold? First, extraction had to be regular. Grain, livestock, craft goods, and labor obligations had to reach central institutions in predictable amounts. A state cannot plan anything if revenue is episodic. Second, records had to reduce ambiguity. Early writing like notation, labels, and seal systems did not need to look like later literary texts to be revolutionary. Their function was administrative clarity: who sent what, from where, to whom, under whose authority. Third, local power had to be absorbed rather than erased. Most local elites were not simply annihilated. Many were integrated into a ranked hierarchy. They kept status and influence, but now operated under crown-centered rules and expectations. Fourth, kingship had to be morally legible. Rule sustained only by fear is expensive and unstable. Rule framed as maintenance of order can mobilize cooperation at lower cost. Religion matters here, but not as decoration. Early Egyptian political theology tied kingship to cosmic balance, ritual correctness, and the proper relationship between humans, land, and the divine sphere. Later Egyptians call this ordered condition mat. But even in earlier phases, the logic is recognizable. Chaos is dangerous. Proper rule is protective, and participation in state obligations can be presented as participation in order itself. That framing made extraction easier to justify and resistance easier to portray as disorder, not policy disagreement. Now look at ordinary people inside this system. Farmers and village households were the material base of early Egyptian power. Their work schedules followed flood rhythms, planting windows, and harvest pressure. Officials did not create agriculture, but they increasingly organized how agricultural surplus was counted and redirected. Transport crews moved goods by river. Craft specialists supplied tools and prestige items. Labor teams built and maintained storage and ceremonial infrastructure. If we tell unification only through kings, we miss the mechanism that made kings effective. Labor organization was not uniform everywhere. Conditions changed by region, season, and local leadership. Still, the trend is toward greater central coordination, especially in how obligations were recorded and enforced. This is why the early state was able to survive succession. A ruler died, the administrative frame remained. External connections added another layer. Early Egypt was never sealed off. Nubian exchange routes mattered for prestige goods and strategic depth. Levantine contacts shaped access to materials and ideas. Border zones required both force and negotiation. A ruler who claimed two lands also had to manage the edges where those lands touched other political worlds. This is one reason early military activity cannot be separated from administration. Campaigns provided opportunities for display and control, but the long game was always supply, route security, and political signaling to both domestic and foreign audiences. A victory inscription could impress. A functioning distribution system could govern. Industry and craft production also need to sit in this picture. Early dynastic power was not only fields and taxes. It depended on workshops, transport labor, and controlled access to skilled work. Stone vessel production, elite goods, ceremonial equipment, and high-status objects required coordination between quarries, craft sites, river transport, and court demand. When elite consumption was organized through central channels, political hierarchy became visible in daily material life. People could see who had access to which goods, whose marks authenticated deliveries, and whose officials could command labor at scale. Mining and procurement routes mattered for the same reason. Expeditions into the Eastern Desert and Sinai regions, where evidence appears in later clearer form and likely has earlier roots, were not random adventures. They were state projects requiring planning, provisioning, and secure return lines. Even when direct evidence for every early expedition is incomplete, the institutional capacity needed for this type of extraction was developing in the unification era. A kingdom that cannot move resources from distant zones cannot sustain elite networks for long. Law and dispute management are less visible in this early period than in later papyrus-rich eras, but the structural logic is already there. Once the crown claims authority over two lands, local conflict cannot remain purely local. Property disagreements, labor obligations, inheritance tensions, and tax disputes must be mediated through recognized hierarchy. We do not have a complete legal code from this phase, and we should not invent one. What we can infer is that officials, local headmen, and temple-linked authorities increasingly worked inside a court-defined order where judgment, obligation, and punishment were expected to align with royal legitimacy. This matters because predictable dispute resolution lowers the cost of governance. If every conflict requires direct coercion, the state burns resources. If disputes can be processed through accepted procedures and ranked officials, the center governs farther with fewer soldiers. In that sense, early Egyptian law was not a separate box from politics. It was one of the tools that converted conquest into routine rule. At this stage, what can we say confidently and what remains uncertain? We can say with high confidence that political centralization accelerated in the late 4th and early 3rd millennium, that royal ideology linked control of Upper and Lower Egypt, and that administrative technologies expanded alongside elite power. We can say with moderate confidence that specific rulers associated with early dynastic consolidation pursued integrated strategies of force, symbolism, and bureaucracy, and that key centers such as Abydos and Memphis served different but complementary political roles. We are less certain about exact event sequences, exact territorial boundaries at every moment, and precise one-to-one matches between later king lists and the earliest rulers. Sources are uneven. Some are ceremonial and propagandistic. Some are fragmentary. Archaeology gives patterns more reliably than it gives a complete day-by-day narrative. That uncertainty is not a weakness in the story. It is part of doing history honestly. You can still explain the structure even when every individual episode cannot be reconstructed with certainty. If we step back, unification in Egypt is best understood as a transition from competitive river polities to durable territorial governance. The crown did not just claim land. It reorganized how obligations moved through society. That reorganization changed class relations. Court-connected administrators, military retainers, and temple-linked authorities gained leverage. Local leaders became intermediaries rather than sovereign rivals. Rural producers remained essential but increasingly governed by distant systems of demand. Political integration created stability for some and new burdens for others. It also changed time horizons. Before durable integration, power often rises and falls with a single leader and his immediate coalition. After integration, institutions can plan beyond one reign. Storage can be forecast. Labor can be scheduled. Monuments can be conceived as multi-year state projects, not temporary displays. This point is where many modern viewers underestimate the period. They treat early unification as prologue and wait for pyramids. In reality, the Pyramid Age depends on this earlier administrative revolution. Without integrated extraction, ranked officials, transport reliability, and ideological legitimacy, later monumental projects would collapse under their own logistical weight. You can already see the template: political center, provincial mediation, river logistics, surplus conversion, elite ideology, and visible state performance. Later dynasties refine this template. They do not invent it from scratch. That is why Narmer and the rulers around him matter beyond the image of a king striking an enemy. The deeper achievement was turning victory into governance, governance into continuity, and continuity into state capacity. From there, Egypt enters a new phase where the question is no longer whether unification can happen. The question becomes how far a unified state can scale its control over labor, resources, and memory, and what kinds of projects it will build to prove that scale to its own people and to everyone beyond the Nile.